Thank me later for trying to make a shorter video by doing it again. Here we go. Let's talk about EQ, equalization. I am saying that this is probably the most important element to mixing after volume and panning and effects and all. Yeah, it's very, very important. Okay, so what is EQ? EQ is the process of sonically sculpting a sound. You're either boosting or you're cutting amplitude. And we refer to those two perspectives that you're coming from as additive EQ, that you're adding something that you want to hear, something, or accentuating something that you like about the sound, or subtractive EQ, where you're kind of taking some sound, some element away from a sound that you don't find to be the sweet spot. There's a lot that goes into EQ, so let's go through some of this kind of text, and then we'll listen to some things. So EQ is frequency. We've talked about sound essentially being vibrations in the air, and the frequency at which those sounds vibrate is kind of correlated to pitch. The higher the frequency, the more cycles that you'd see in a waveform, and that does translate to a higher pitch. Frequency and pitch are really go hand in hand. So if you think about a high piano note, it is going to be a faster waveform, while a low tone, low pitch, or bass frequencies, lower frequencies, are going to be longer. They're going to take longer to develop, longer to translate, or longer to reach your ears. We look at EQ on an XY axis, the X axis being frequency. We say typically that the human ear can hear, maybe when you're young and healthy, from 20 hertz all the way up to 22,000 hertz. And the Y axis is amplitude plus or minus whether you're adding or subtracting amplitude. The frequency scale is measured in hertz, and the amplitude scale is measured in decibels. The main parameters of an EQ. So we already talked about up and down, the amplitude scale. We talked about frequency on the x-axis. The only other one really is bandwidth, which is how narrow or how wide the range of the surrounding frequencies that you're going to adjust. So if, a very wide bandwidth, this is our center. As we raise that up, we're bringing a bunch of surrounding frequencies along with it. This one here, very narrow, we're cutting, at a specific point, and very little around it is coming with it. All right, so I'll come back to when to EQ. Let's look at some things. So I have already gone through some stuff. I kind of want to talk through the moves that I made. So let's look at the snare drum first, and I'm going to bypass it. And I will solo it. I've turned off my gating. I have some compression for a future video. Okay, so what did I do? So I have this is the 7-band, so EQ, the EQ3 7-band. It is what's available in Pro Tools and comes with Pro Tools. So what I did is a few things. And often what we will do across many or all of our tracks is something that's called a high-pass filter over here, or also referred to as a low-cut filter. That essentially is another one of those cumulative effects of having sound that's not part of the sweet spot of the instrument. Let me kind of step back for a second. Every instrument fills a particular place in the frequency scale. You're going to have your kick drum going to be further down on the low end. Your snare drum your cymbals are going to be higher pitched or higher frequency instruments. So if you have something that really lives over in the high frequencies, there may be some low frequency information in that signal, but it's not necessarily doing any good for the sound, and in fact is probably going to cloudy and muddy up your overall mix, as many instruments that don't have important information down in this area start to add up and accumulate low-end mud, which is often what we refer to it as. Like a guitar is not going to be living down here. A vocal, especially a female vocal, for example, is not going to be living down in the low end. So we want to cut things in order to make space, make space for the things that do live down here, like the kick and the bass, for example. Okay, so back to what I've actually done on the snare drum. So I engaged the high-pass filter. I put a pretty steep curve on it. You can see that this is essentially the curve of your filter. And I adjusted it to be at about 160. My feeling was that there's nothing, maybe a little bit lower than that. There's nothing that important in a snare drum that's going to be that low. So I can cut it. I did raise, so going back, kind of going through the different parameters. This is called the 7-band, by the way. You have two filters, the high pass and the low pass. Then you have low frequency, low mid frequency, high mids, and high frequencies going, from left to right on the x-axis. In mentioning those three parameters that we have, these are called parametric EQs, which give you those three controls of the Q, the bandwidth, which is also referred to as Q, the frequency, and the amplitude gain. You can see that I cut and added depending on what it was I was trying to accomplish. So I did add a little bit of low end, above. It's kind of, okay, so I'm contradicting myself a little bit. Actually, I made a mistake. My low cut filter was set to about 60. All right. I was looking at my low frequencies. So everything below 60 is cut. At around 150, which I kind of is the low end of a snare drum, I did bring that up by just 1.3 decibels. Didn't change the Q, is at 1. In the low mids, at 632, I really think of that area as kind of a boxy, kind of a cardboard boxy kind of sound. So I cut that pretty significantly with 4 decibels off at 632 with a bit wider of a curve, a bandwidth. In my mid frequencies at 2000 or 2.2, which is going to be kind of that sharper attack of the snare, I brought that up because that is the job of the snare drum by 3.6 decibels at, again, 2200 hertz or 2.21 kilohertz, and the high mids at around 3.7, which again kind of just more in that sharp kind of, again, going for the actually I didn't really do anything with that one. I take that back. So even though it's in, there's no real gain adjustment there. But the high frequency shelf, okay, so if you look at it like this, a shelf means that you are bringing everything above the point at which you are raising, above that frequency point, everything above it is going with you. If you change that to parametric, which you do have the choice, you can see that it goes back down, but I didn't want that. I wanted everything above 5,000 to kind of go up. And we refer to that area usually around, 8 to 10,000 and above. We sometimes refer to as air. You'll hear that on the cymbals on this track. Now, I turned off the gate. We talked about how maybe I wouldn't gate this song on drums on this song given the style of playing. But let's turn this off for a second. I'm I'm just going to play you the snare drum and then listen to, as I put it in, so concentrate on the cymbals. And now concentrate on the snare itself, kind of like the attack of that metal, the metallic element. And then if you can hear it, and I could bring this down, by itself, just the lack of, the cardboardy sense, the boxiness. Okay, just way cleaner, brighter, everything about it. Let's look what I did on the kick. So on the kick, let's listen to it. Okay, so I did cut a little bit of the low 40 because I want the bass to live down there. So I'm kind of anticipating the bass going to kind of cover some of that. I did boost about 74 by 2 decibels. I cut 121. Those are not super specific. It's just where I moved things and it sounded good to me. It's kind of a resonant area. In my mid frequencies, 520. That again is that boxiness. The high mids I did raise, but I didn't really nothing actually. I didn't do anything with my Qs here, which I probably could have. But 1.8, I was going for some attack. I wanted to try and hit the beater where it hits the head. So again, what I'm cutting are things I don't like. I don't like boxiness. I don't like too much, resonant low end. But I wanted to hear that attack of the beater hitting the drum. I wanted to feel it a little bit here in my chest. And then again up here, air or just some clarity overall to the drum. So let's turn that off and listen to it and turn it on. So it is much brighter. You can hear the snare drum a lot more. Boxiness, a little bit of a wet blanket. No blanket. Now, one reason that I'm not afraid of making this pretty bright is that we have the sub kick. And that's going to give us a lot of what we need here. Now, what did I do on the sub kick? I don't even remember. Pretty aggressive low pass filter. There's nothing up here that I need. In fact, like all the sub is doing is giving me low frequencies. Let's see if we can hear a difference. Actually just helps to cut what little, cymbal bleed there is, because the cymbals are up here, some of the guitars up here, around 3,000 probably. Going down the line, what did I do to the under snare? Actually, this is a really important point and probably going to be on your quiz. This is something that I don't know if you'll hear the difference here, but I'm going to explain it because it's very, very important. This button here is called the phase switch or flip. And what it does, and we're going to look at it. Well, I can't look at it, but I'm going to explain it. Is when you have a drum sound or any sound, a waveform, I'm going to go right close to the transient. If we zoom in on this thing, it has to do with when the sound of the source, the signal, is hitting the microphone. And microphones are at different distances from the source, and therefore what happens is that the sound can be recorded out of phase. And that means when we're looking at troughs and, in our cycles here, You want to see them all go up together if it's the same instrument for that matter. So you can see here that we have a dip when our undersnare is going up. So these are completely out of phase. We want to see this part going down when this one's going down. There's a couple ways to achieve that. And in fact, you can highlight the whole track and go to Audio Suite and Other and Invert. And that will invert the entire waveform. So you're going to see this flip. Did I miss hitting render? Yeah. Okay, so technically that is better now and in phase, but it's a little bit difficult to work with. Not difficult, but you can also undo that. You can also just come over here and click on that button, and that essentially is flipping the phase. So I'm going to kind of take that out and listen to some of the snare drums together. Usually you're going to hear it in the lower end. What happens when things are out of phase is frequencies cancel each other out, and you start to hear what's called comb filtering, and it just isn't as thick as thick a sound. So let's see what we can hear by flipping the phase. You hear it a lot. It's literally like it's almost a different pitch. Let's see if we can kind of listen to the same drum over and over again. Slightly annoying, but I can't hear it with that flam. Phase in phase, out of phase. Just a thicker drum sound. Now, that is something to consider with your overheads in relation to the snare drum, because the snare drum is often, especially the close mic, is going to arrive at the microphone sooner than it arrives at the overhead microphone. But I'm not going to get into, these are completely out of phase as well. Did I do anything about it? Let's check it out. Let's add the overheads and see if flipping the phase does anything for us. Let me go back and get a short, just a snare. Yep. Cack. Add the room mic. Because it also looked like it was. We also do this in different ways. We often will cut this and literally move this over, is another way of doing it, so that they fall in line with each other. But so far I'm happy with just the flip of the EQ. All right, so I could do a whole video on phase. What else did I do here? Going down the line. Okay, so let's talk about the undersnare. Again, cutting all the lows. This is a much brighter sound, the undersnare. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the undersnare. Looks like I pretty much did the same thing as the snare drum on the overheads. Again, even though it's capturing the whole drum kit, we have a pretty solid kick drum sound. So I wanted to accentuate the cymbals more than anything else. Kind of kick, so bring up that air, cut some of that low mid frequency or that mid frequency. drum room. Probably pretty similar. This one's naturally going to have more kick drum. Brightening it up. Okay, on the toms EQ. So this was something that, this is pretty dramatic, I think. Let's turn off the gate. Like, it literally changes the pitch. So on this one again, this 500 range, I call that the box. And then pitching up around 2000. I didn't do any cuts. I could have. Didn't cut because I really was using the gate and it wasn't that important to me. But certainly could probably put in a bit of a low frequency cut. On the mid tom, same thing. Those toms, I probably, did I go a little bit lower given the fact that it is pitched a bit lower? A little bit. Yeah, a little bit. So I accentuated a lower pitch, or lower frequency, I should say, to be accurate. And then, not too much lower on the tom, but this, the low tom, I should say. The low tom, those of you who know the low tom, is a horrible sounding drum. It resonates and it just goes forever. So I wanted to kind of bring it up in pitch. I also wanted to cut some of that low resonance that was going to, just sound bad as it accumulated. So let's see what the kind of tom roll sounds like with the things off. I have compression on it, but we're going to get to that later. Okay. I think the gates work fine here. Okay, moving on. I won't talk about that. Let's talk about the bass. Let's talk about the bass. So the bass was recorded direct, meaning no amp. It was just plugged into the preamp. And it's kind of meh sounding. So you can see that I have a lot going on here, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to talk about what's in the EQ. So I did, remember I had cut all of this low end on the kick drum. So I wanted to add some to the bass. I added some 1.3, which I consider to be the string sound on the fretboard. I like that, especially in this style of music, of fusion kind of. And then some even higher, around 5,000, to even kind of bring that out a bit more. So let's listen to that off. So some of that growl of the strings up there. I'll leave it at that. The guitar. So again, I'm cutting the low end because the guitar is not going to be down there. We're just saving that cumulative effect. Guitar lives between the sweet spot, let's say 2.5 and 5. So I'm raising about 2.8, maybe even up a little higher, around 3. And that's about it. It's a nice sounding guitar, but I wanted it to cut a little bit more. So just to give it a little bit more bite. I didn't put any EQ on the second guitar, at least not for now. I'm going to say that that was just a decision in the moment. Actually, I'm sorry, that was the EQ of them. That's a reverb. I did EQ the other guitar. similarly to this one. So I apologize. I'm soloing the wrong stuff. I've gotten ahead of everyone else. What else did I do? The piano. I wanted to brighten up that piano and cut some of the box. Although I didn't want to get too much of the bell going. I did EQ the sax and the bone, mostly by cutting some of that boxiness again. Everything's going to suffer from that here and there. All right, and again, by cutting a little bit, we get some of what we're looking to do. We don't have to add it. We can just cut it. Okay, so all my horns, I kind of did the same thing as a starting point. All right, so there's our EQ